Okay, if recording is in progress and it's 12 o'clock noon, it is time to go. Welcome, everyone. We are going to talk about the State Local Cyber Grant Program, the Information Sharing Act of 2015, what's happening with CISA, what's happening with the executive order putting state and local governments in the hot seat for disaster recovery and infrastructure protection and a bunch of other stuff. So today is September 30th, tomorrow is October 1st, and unless Congress acts, a whole bunch of things are just going to go away tonight. And notably, it's that Information Sharing Act 2015 and the Cyber Grant Program. So Fred and I are going to talk about this. Here's me. I've done these things. I worked really quite a while in government as the CISO of the city of Seattle, a policy advisor to state government, and vice chair of a Homeland Security Government Coordinating Council. And I will explain what that is. My co-Yoda is Fred Langston here. Fred, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I've been doing this almost 30 years myself, really focused in healthcare and critical infrastructure. So this is clearly important to me as well as to everybody in this country.
Yeah, and just to make sure I throw you under the bus appropriately, if anybody's having trouble with the HIPAA security rule, they can thank you, right?
Yeah. Well, we're getting ready to change it. Still,
Get
still
ready to
on the
change it.
floor. Still on the floor of
Okay.
Congress. Okay.
All right. All right. So let's get going. Let's talk about this. So what I want to do is I want to develop what the this is what I call it, the ecosystem of critical infrastructure protection in the United States is, where it came from, what are the moving parts, what are we about to lose, and how can we compensate for the loss of those things. So here are the critical sectors. So dams, finance, water, energy, right? The critical sectors are defined as those things that, if disrupted, are going to affect us at the scale we live our lives, right? Quality of life, life sustaining, life safety services, things like that. And the reason I have a few of them in blue here is because that's what your local government does for you. They handle communications for law enforcement, public safety, they manage traffic, emergency management, 911, all the things that your local government does considered critical infrastructure. And they are really in the crosshairs of all of this. There's a lot of others, and I don't know, the narrative that has emerged over the last almost 20 years is that most of critical infrastructure is in the hands of the private sector. They are the owner operators. So the government doesn't run nuclear reactors. The government does not run farms and the whole automation in the agriculture industry, things like that. But there are a lot of critical sectors that are operated by your local government. And me, coming from local government, we're going to be a little bit centric on some of those things. And but we are going to dive into what are the implications here for the private sector. So the ecosystem of critical infrastructure protection starts with these, what we used to call SSAs, sector-specific agencies. Now they're called sector risk management agencies, SRMAs. So for example, the EPA regulates water. Health and Human Services regulates the healthcare sector. Interestingly, pipelines. Fred, you remember the Colonial Pipeline thing? And what was the other thing that happened simultaneously with JBS Meats, right?
Yep.
Right? And
Yep.
this was on a Memorial Day. This is the thing that happened that kind of put a lot of things into motion that have landed us where we are. So when we saw the Colonial Pipeline get hit and 45% of the fuel supply to the East Coast disrupted, started to look around. Well, what's the sector risk management agency that's supposed to be regulating the pipeline sector? And Fred, do you remember what the agency is?
Yes, it's the TSA.
That's right. It's the TSA. And so all of a sudden, everybody's like, whoa, TSA is not giving any guidance to pipelines. Maybe we should do that. So SRMAs, right? They do sector-specific risk management. They create sector-specific plans. They facilitate information sharing within the sector and with government organizations so that everybody can understand, hey, here's what we've seen. You need to watch out for this. So sector risk management agencies are a part of this infrastructure, as are government coordinating councils. And so, as I said, I was on a government coordinating council. I got to be a member when I was the CISO for the city of Seattle. And eventually they made me vice chair. And then I essentially ran screaming out of government. But these are very useful. The government coordinating councils bring the sector in, and under these very specific rules called CPAC, There are communications that are allowed and there are communications that are prohibited. For example, vendors can't do any kind of selling in this place. And so there has to be a designated federal officer present at all time at a government coordinating council. So what they're doing is they're trying to facilitate this communication between mostly private sector critical infrastructure providers and those federal agencies, the sector risk management agencies that are responsible for regulating and enforcing those regulations. And when I say regulating, that is really the role of the rule-making process. And I'll get to this in a second, how all of that is in question now. But periodically, the sector risk management agencies can come up with rules and say, this is your new regulation, or we've expanded this regulation. And there was a lot of pushback to that, and we'll get to that in a minute. So that's government coordinating councils. Now there are sector coordinating councils. And the sector coordinating councils really try to bring the sector, so all the dam operators, for example, and retail and different things like government facilities, they can bring in just strictly government. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to push out, here are the best practices. You need to talk to us, talk amongst yourselves, right? And so this is not, these sector coordinating councils are not under these CPAC rules. This is where people can speak freely, but they speak freely under the Information Sharing Act of 2015. The Information Sharing Act of 2015, which was pioneered by the financial sector ISAC, creates an insulation layer so that disclosures that you make in that context cannot be held against you by regulators, by markets, by anybody. It's supposed to be secret, so you can share information like that. So a sector coordinating council is where a whole lot of that went on. And then there's ISACs. And what happened after ISACs in the Obama administration, they also created the notion of ISAOs, Information Sharing and Analysis Organizations, so that anybody could put together something like this. And I will say, just backing up a little bit, this entire infrastructure, this ecosystem, comes from the National Infrastructure Protection Plan of 2013 and is based on PPD 21, Presidential Policy Directive 2021 in 2012 by the Obama administration. Said, all right, you got to put together this, framework of how we're going to manage critical infrastructure, and it included all of these things. So not all of the ISACs are as effective as some of the others. The one I think that in state and local government is the multi-state ISAC, which has been pretty effective at pushing out information. They have a monitoring platform that can be used by everyone to let you know if you're talking to an address or a domain on the internet that we have designated as bad, you get an alert for things like that. So this has been very useful. Fred, can you talk about any of the other ISACs and how their effectiveness has been? Like I'm pretty aligned with government, but you're more out in the private sector.
Yeah, well, as the Financial Services ISAC is a very, very powerful organization, but they provide much more of an advisory role. What you don't see in that, what you see in the MS ISAC is some of the alignment with the Center for Internet Security and a bunch of programs that they've put together, and then they offer, as you're saying, Mike, I believe they're still offering the CISA vulnerability scanning, which we all thought was going away with the loss of funding, but I believe the funding for that is actually still in place. And I believe if you're a municipality, you can get that scanning via the multi-state ISAC arrangement with Center for Internet Security. Same with you were mentioning Malcolm, right?
Yeah.
And so they have some of that, and then there's a kind of a CrowdStrike very kind of single purpose version of CrowdStrike. I think you can get through that for small local government through the multi-state ISAC as well. Outside of that, all the ISACs tend to function very differently in how they're serving their particular communities.
Yeah, and doesn't the health ISAC provide guidance for how to comply with regulatory requirements? And didn't they come up with the what they call The CPGs, the cyber performance goals,
Yeah, so the HICP, right? Wasn't it the
the
HICP and the
hiccup,
cyber, yeah, hiccup. Thank
the
you.
hiccup.
The hiccup and the cyber performance goals. Yes. So, well, that was more of a consortium. The cyber performance goals was more than just, I think it was the Health ISAC was running it, but they brought in people who were not necessarily part of that, I believe, to collaborate on that. But yeah, the CPGs, I don't know if we're ever going to see those really come back. You and I might be the few people that remember those
Yeah.
at this point. But what really I think will push the ball down the field in healthcare is the fact that the HIPAA bill that's rewriting HIPAA is still moving forward, which we all thought would be DOA. Um, when the administration changed. So hopefully they stick to that and keep pushing that forward.
We sure say hopefully a lot when we're talking about we're waiting for the federal government to do something.
Yeah, I think that's always the
Yeah.
case.
Okay, well,
Yeah.
so the ISACs, right? This is all about information sharing. They facilitate this gathering of information from the sectors, distribute it throughout the sector. They have varying levels of membership required for things like these. Sometimes you can just be a member if you are, for example, in the water sector, you're just a member of the water ISAC. Some of these you have to join, you have to be vetted in, right, for obvious reasons. They also have recommendations on tools you can use. Fred, you just brought up the Malcolm platform, which is for monitoring operational technologies. It was developed at Idaho National Labs with Homeland Security funding. If you're interested in that, the URL is malcolm.fyi, and you can read all about it. And I'll actually come back to that a little bit. But helping that sector, right, the ISAC, the Information Sharing and Analysis Organization, to do what they can to be resilient when things happen. So things are going to happen, right? A cyber event is foreseeable. That's the way lawyers talk about it, right? Standard of foreseeability. You got to do something about that. And resilience is really the key here. You are going to take a punch. And that punch can knock you out, or you can get up off the mat before the 10 count. And if you do the latter, that's resilience. You take a punch and you can get back to work. And so they're trying to really lean into the resilience part of this, I think, much more than the prevention part of this, because when you're going glove to glove with what has been called the third largest economy in the world, cybercrime, you're not going to win. You are not going to win, but you can minimize that impact. So ISACs spend quite a bit of time helping everybody to put the controls in place to quickly recover when there is an event.
Well, and it's also a place to share information somewhat anonymously about what you have been through, with the hopes that you can help others be prepared for the same eventuality.
Right. And which is the crux of the Information Sharing Act of
Right.
2015.
Right.
Okay. Okay. All right. And then it all started to fall apart. so so here's the backstory on this. So the Sector Risk Management Agency for Maritime Ports is the U.S. Coast Guard, right? The Coast Guard is part of Homeland Security, just like FEMA is part of Homeland Security and CIS is part of Homeland Security. So the Coast Guard says, hey, ports, you have to do a facility security plan every couple of years, talking about your physical security, right? Along with that, we would like you to submit a cyber risk assessment so that we understand exactly what kind of controls we can help you put in place if you are deficient in those controls. And it worked great. Okay. So then the EPA says, hey, water sector, you have to do a sanitary survey every year, or maybe it's every 2 years, right? Because the American Clean Water Drinking Act really only regulates water purity more and not really security, right? So this is new. So through the rulemaking process, the EPA decided that water utilities and waste treatment need to supply a cyber risk assessment along with their sanitary survey, which has always been required. And 3 states sued and said this is an unfunded mandate. And the Sector Risk Management Agency, the EPA, backed right off. And then right after that, the Supreme Court overturned what's called the Chevron deference ruling. And what the Chevron deference ruling was, it stated that the sector risk management agencies could interpret the regulations that they were enforcing. Okay. And the Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that anymore. So now all of a sudden, this entire ecosystem is in question here. We don't know. if we're going to continue with sector coordinating councils, government coordinating councils, ISACs will probably be around. Sector risk management agencies will maybe de-designated as a risk management agency because what I have heard, Fred, maybe you can confirm or disconfirm if you're a Big Lebowski fan, that there was an effort in Homeland Security Committee in the House of Representatives where the chair, Republican chair, said we would like CISA to take on two things: more of the sector risk management agency responsibilities for enforcement and to administer a 10-year renewal of the state local cyber grant program. Did you hear those same things?
Yes, yes, I did.
See, I think that's smart. It also looks like it ain't going to happen. But now, I mean, we don't know. Like by tomorrow, they could figure out how to put these things back together. My money is definitely on no.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, in any event, these are the things that started to happen to take down the effectiveness of that infrastructure that we have for critical infrastructure protection. Okay. And then we got this. And nothing that is going on right now can be decoupled from this executive order because it says basically state and local government are now responsible for disaster management and critical infrastructure protection in your states. All right. And so what does that mean? It means Duluth, you're going to go glove to glove with the North Koreans. That's what it means. All right. Federal assistance is not going to be there. If you read this executive order, and I have, there's a long list of policies and processes that have just been shifted over to states to manage. So, for example, a sector specific plan for the water sector in your state is now the responsibility of the state and not the sector coordinating council that gets together with the federal government to come up with that. And indeed, governors, right after this thing happened with the EPA, governors were tasked with come up with your sector specific plan for the water sector. So all that's it's being pushed onto states. There's no doubt about it. Interestingly, it's got all these things you got to do, but there's no funding in there. Not only is there no funding there, the state local cyber grant program is coming to an end. Right now is the third round of the grant here in Washington State, and some of this will be a little centric to Washington State because I know a lot of this. Here in Washington State, we have $3 million this year to distribute, $2 million next year, and then that's it. No more grant. So everything that CISA has been doing for us is in question. So that would be the cyber hygiene program. That's probably going to continue, right? That's where they scan your perimeter. The penetration testing that they will do, that will probably continue, but the list is so long, the backlog is so long, you're looking probably 2 years out before they get around to you, and that makes it pretty ineffective. The bulletins that go out, here's an extant threat against a certain sector. Maybe those will continue, maybe not. The known exploited vulnerabilities catalog, where they work with the CVSS crew to make sure that not only is this a vulnerability that's been announced, we know it's under active exploit, right? Which means your urgency to get that patch, to get that update in there goes way up. Don't know if that's going to continue. And in fact, the funding for the CVE program and the CVSS program got cut for a while. And Fred, is that back or what? I mean, what's the status on that?
It's supposedly back, and there was also a movement in industry to find a way to fund it within the government externally. I don't know how that works in a government context, but
Yeah.
I believe people have figured this is a national resource that we have to manage because you don't want to have the rest of the world managing what's secure and what's not. That's just not
Yeah.
a good idea.
Well, and that's exactly what's happening. The EU said, well, we're just going to do it ourselves.
Yeah,
You
yeah,
know,
they already have begun doing it.
they have.
So yeah,
Right. I mean, MITRE lost its funding to manage this for a while, and then
right,
they gave it a finite extension. I
yeah.
think that runs out sometime soon. But in any event, because of the executive order and because of what happened with the EPA and the sector risk management agencies and the rulemaking process, this whole thing has, I don't want to say it's fallen apart, but it's certainly not as robust as it once was. Other things happen too that we can talk about, right? So we talked about sector risk management agencies and they had to back way off. And we don't know who's going to engage in rulemaking. if it's not going to be the SRMAs. They're the ones that know what they're doing. Doge came in and started firing everybody in CISA, starting with the one division within CISA that does oversight over foreign disinformation campaigns in order to sway American elections. They cut that. That's great. The MSISAC and Center for Internet Security both lost funding. I read today, Fred, that CISA is going to continue to prop up, probably not the right wording, but the multi-state ISAC because they specifically want the Albert program to continue, eh,
Correct.
which is interesting to me because I never thought the Albert program was that effective, but okay. The Information Sharing Act 2015 is expiring tonight. And let's just dig into that a little bit, right? So tell me and everybody why the Information Sharing Act of 2015 is important.
Because it's the safe harbor for people to share information about this is what happened to me. And the only way you're going to know how to protect yourself is to understand how it happened to me, because otherwise you're just sitting there with no information, right? How do you share this critical information in a safe manner that is not going to come back and lead to fines, lawsuits, et cetera, et cetera?
Regulatory action, a loss of market value, things like that, right? All those could happen if you make disclosures in a public setting rather than privately like that. So I don't know if they do this in a skiff, but certainly within the confines of the Information Sharing Act of 2015, all of that is insulated from regulatory
Yeah.
oversight and a bunch of other bad things. Not the least of which is civil litigation, right? Because now we see all these class action suits happening all the time, and you definitely don't want to make some disclosure that's going to, end up in civil litigation. Yes, the state local cyber grant program is expiring, really needs an extension. This was marvelously useful in helping local governments become more secured. I see that there's a question
Yeah.
in the QA right there. How effective has that been in helping local governments become more secure? Well, um, the first thing, and remember, local governments are critical infrastructure, right? That's the stuff that keeps us alive, keeps your toilet flushing. That's kind of a big deal, right? Toilet's my metaphor for critical infrastructure at the scale I am worried about, right? But I know that a lot of local governments were using these funds to first do an assessment against probably the NIST framework more than anything else, and then create a corrective action plan and use that plan to inform further grant requests for capital purchases, for training, for, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that's been pretty effective. What's the feedback you've gotten, Fred?
I think this has been much, much more effective than we first expected. Because
Yeah,
if you remember, when this first came out, we started doing webinars and we would help small local governments write the grant. So, and we had all sorts of ways we were reaching out, trying to help people start down this road. What we find is once you get through the first one, you find out the grant process, it sounds a lot scarier, frankly, than it really is. Okay,
yeah,
it's not that hard, folks. So you get one under your belt. They give you the money, as you said, Mike. I go, I use that money, and I find things out. Right? Usually, I'm solving some problems, but it also points out other problems. Well, you use that data then to go to the next year's bucket of money, and I think we got one more. This round just ended, but there's one more slug coming. Isn't that correct, Mike? In Washington
there is.
State.
So,
Yeah,
yeah, so I mean, right now they're spending $3 million. Next year, there's $2 million
yeah,
to spend, right? So it's tailed off
right,
from the beginning. It started with FY22 money, and now we're gonna get all the way to the end of this thing. And without a renewal,
right. But people have been reloading on this year in after year.
Mhm.
So getting this is a motion I think every local government should be taking advantage of. Because it's been very, very effective to get things that you probably would never have been able to do on your own, right? Those, I want to do this, I need to do this. You get an opportunity to knock some of those off your list. I would also say it also seems to be an effective way to sell up in your organization if you're trying to get the electeds or a board or a city manager, whomever it is you're trying to convince here. This is a very good way to move the ball down the field because it's something they can get behind, right?
Yeah.
It's not, an unfunded tax mandate. Hey, I need to go spend 100K on this. It's, hey, we have no way to support them and actually go out and get those funds. So, uh, we, I know we have a number of them that just filed for this last round and are looking pretty positive that they're going to be getting some funds back. So,
Good.
uh, the bottom line is we all have Congress people, we all have senators, local politicians. There are some things that are pretty, I think, in a divided time that are not really that divided. We all need good security. Um, Ask, right? Tell them that this is a priority, because it should be. It's not asking for that much to reauthorize these funds for another 10 years, and this is the kind of thing we can all get behind.
Yeah. Talk for a second about what you think the drop in Medicaid funding is going to do to the healthcare sector, especially rural healthcare.
Yeah, so I'm in the middle of my, if you know me, I do twice a year tours of the Midwest, and I go visit rural hospitals and then speak at annual hospital conference. I'm going to Iowa and Nebraska next week, speaking at their hospital associations.
I'm going to Idaho.
Here's what I'll tell you. Cybersecurity has been a keynote topic for last 4 years. We just keep going. This year it is not. Why is that? Because everybody is just trying to keep their pediatric cancer ward open. I'm
Right.
just trying to keep my radiological oncology unit stocked so I can still do cancer treatments for the local people in our area. That's where the money is. That's where the discussion is. It's about, you go and listen to talks, it's about survival. Um, that's a really, really bad place to be in, folks, for rural health care.
It
So,
is. And in
yeah,
the context of states being responsible for critical infrastructure protection, the loss of Medicaid funding by the federal government just took a shiv and stuck it between the ribs of the healthcare sector.
yeah. It's
Yeah.
it's gonna you're gonna see consolidation, and you're gonna have a lot longer drives for rural residents to get primary care, and especially emergency care, even more difficult.
Isn't
So,
this a happy webinar? Isn't this fun? It's good to
yeah,
talk about this stuff. Oh. Okay, all right. Well, some positive things have happened, right? So here in Washington State, right, our county auditors said, hey, you know what? We're going to just pay for everybody to be a member of the multi-state ISAC. Okay, well, that's great, right? So everybody understands the usefulness of the ISAC, don't want it to go away. And so here's county auditors in Washington State stepping up to that. And so a House panel did approve the cyber information sharing restoration and the grant legislation as expiration deadlines loom. Sounds good, huh, Fred?
yeah,
And then this happened. And so, okay, the amendments that were left on the cutting room floor, right? So there's the chair, would have renewed the 2015 Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act and the SLCGP. Both efforts expire on September 30th. That's today, without congressional action. So here we go. And then this is so bubbly. I I don't know if this really happened. I don't know if this really passed out of committee and we got an extension to November 21st. I think it's a moot point with a government shutdown looming right now. But they expired those till or they extended those till November 21st. At least they were trying to do this. And not sure if that actually happened, but even if they did, that's really a stopgap and it's not going to last long. I don't know how long of a government shutdown we could potentially be looking at here. I don't think it would last till November 21st. So if this stays in place till November 21st, and remember, there is no more money in the SLCGP. There's none.
right.
It's all been allocated, right? So they would have to renew this in order put to allocate new funds to go out to local governments. And by the way, there's 90,000 local governments in the United States. It's going to require some money. So we don't know what's going on. Nobody knows what's going on. All right, but now let's talk about, all right, that's all the stuff we've lost. That's all of the, uncertainty caused by the dysfunction of Congress. What do we got to do? So, number one, to me, is telemetry across the state geography, right? We need to know what events are happening in our local governments, right? Because government is different than the private sector. We can just say, do this. And For the most part, they got to do it. Some of them are, reluctant to do it, but it comes with incentives. And if you want those incentives, like, for example, if you want to keep using the state system to look up license plate information for law enforcement, you will do this. So they have those levers they can pull. I don't know about the Albert program. I read today that specifically that CISA wants to prop up multi-state ISAC to continue the Albert program, and that might be more around election security than anything else. I don't know. But election security, remember what CISA would do is they would go to deploy monitoring technology so that we could understand if there were attempts to compromise the IT systems that hold up voting. And by the way, they never found anything like that, right? It was mostly disinformation. So election security, how are we going to counter disinformation and, identify it and quickly counter it? Because that is the main thing that's going to be coming, right? Having gotten rid of the committee or the division within CISA that handles election interference by foreign governments and specifically disinformation, I don't know if we're tooled up to do that at all. Um, Definitely information sharing and threat communication. That can be done within a state. I think that's probably one of the bigger focus areas right now is how are we going to share information around our own critical infrastructure providers in the state and an incident response coalition. So CISA and the FBI actually will send responders if there is an event. And that's not going to happen anymore. I don't know about the FBI, but that is definitely not going to happen with CISA anymore. So we need to have a coalition. Workforce development. We really need to get more practitioners available and ideally bring the price per practitioner down, right? They're expensive, they're flaky, they'll change jobs every 6 months because they know they can double their salary. And then regulation. And I would add to this a grant program as well. State running a grant program rather than the federal government running a grant program seems like a good idea whose time has come. And when I say regulation, there are some states that are already doing this successfully, and that does compensate for the political winds blowing in Congress. You're regulated, you're not, because that's just going to keep happening.
I want to point out some of the obvious on that last slide, Mike,
Sure.
on the difficulties of what we're asking the world for this country and the states to do here. This you mentioned coalition. I think this is the only possible approach is to try to recreate something similar to the centralized authority of the federal government. Maybe it's an interstate agency that gets created to because you cannot have 50 different ways of doing the
That's
same
right.
thing. That will not work.
That's
50
right.
different enforcement methodologies is a drag on commerce and capitalism that we cannot possibly tolerate. This is doing it 50 times over. First thing to say is not the answer. So I
It's the way
think,
privacy
yeah,
statutes are today.
yeah. So we have to do something to look at this at a national level,
I agree.
because again, you can't coordinate 50 different entities in a national defense. That is it's hard enough. Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, and now Space Force, um, and let's add 50 states to that. I'm not seeing that possible. So I think we need a fresh approach. While we clearly this is what we need to do, how we do this is going to be key to whether it succeeds or not.
Yeah, I agree. And if you're in the private sector and you run afoul of regulatory requirements in a state, is there a patchwork of other states that all have different, enforcement mechanisms and, how you're going to, so I can see how this, the private sector is really not going to like something like this that evolves, right? So
Yes.
a nationalized strategy, even if it's National Governors Association getting together and saying, let's all do this the same way. Yeah, something like that's got to happen. Okay, what's going on with other states? So many of them are setting up these operation centers. And that's essentially for not only statewide telemetry, they will monitor their local governments and public utilities and probably rural healthcare for cyber events, but also be in a position to share that information with other partners. So that's great. Texas and California, and there are others that are setting these up. You can see, what is it? Nevada wants an operation center. Wisconsin and Michigan have led the way with volunteer responders. So in Michigan, it's the C3, the uh, uh, cyber something coalition, cyber something coalition. It's MC3, I think. But in Wisconsin, that is the model that we're looking at in Washington state to emulate. Um, in Hawaii, Montana, and definitely in Washington state, we're working on workforce development using the Pisces project. I'll talk about that in a minute. New York has been really good at regulating their sectors. So they have regulated their healthcare sector and their finance sector much in the way that the sector risk management agencies of the federal government were doing for the sector writ large, but it's just confined to New York. And again, this is where we get into different regulations in different states. And all of a sudden, if you have to comply with something, it's really going to be difficult to do. But they're doing a good job of this. The regulations in New York are very similar to the ones from the federal government, but they are insulated from, again, the political winds blowing another way and everybody changing their minds, right? You can't do that to the state. It's interesting though, one thing the states are going to be hard to pull off is an information sharing mechanism that keeps everybody out of regulatory trouble and keeps them out of consumer view and competitor view and things like that. Because one of the big things about the Information Sharing Act 2015 was that you could make those pronouncements in there and not, be held accountable for something like that or held responsible for, regulatory lapse or something like that. A state cannot insulate you from federal regulatory oversight, right? So that's going to be a little different. But you can see there's a whole lot of stuff going on here, and states are stepping up to this. So in Washington State, what do we have? We have a comprehensive emergency management plan and an annex for significant cyber disruption. And I know that because I helped to write it. We have volunteer organizations for incident response. So there's the VCERT. We have information sharing organizations that we can put back together as maybe a quarterly meeting where everybody's vetted in. It's done in a secure facility. Right now, it's just a bunch of people getting together, drinking beers and talking. Pisces, the Public Infrastructure Security Cyber Education System, can be used for statewide monitoring and workforce development. In Washington State, there's also an initiative at the state CISO level called the STIC, the State Threat Information Center, and there are state level grants. So, and largely the state level grants in Washington State are run through the state auditor's office, and the state auditor can come out and do assessments for local governments and other organizations. Okay, well, so what's the state need to do? Well, we need to provide leadership for this information sharing forum, right? Nobody is going to participate in this if they don't think it's being well run, well organized, and we have some kind of barrier to these disclosures making it out in the public. Conduct exercises, right? We need to practice things, significant cyber disruption. I think everybody saw what happened to a dam in Norway. Well, it turns out in our state, a whole lot of our power comes from falling water. And so we really need to exercise what happens if we lose a dam operation or somebody takes control of it and does what they did in Norway and open the spillway and what happens downstream. This is where the emergency management people are really, in fact, I talked at an emergency management conference last week about these things. Align with regional monitoring, right? So we have this statewide telemetry. We know we can see the doorknob twisting going on across the state. And then legislative efforts for reasonable regulation, hopefully in cooperation with other states and this coalition for incident response. And yeah, it's, I don't know if we're going to be able to fund a state grant program because all the states have budgets that have been crushed. But the last thing, and give me a quick read on this, Fred. What do you think about deterrence options? Right? I mean, we always catch somebody and make it really public, how they were dragged through the courts and penalized and they're going to prison forever, right? But what we cannot do is what the DoD does, which is defend forward, right? We can't
Correct.
do what the FBI does, which is go out and melt criminal infrastructure that's being used against us. Can you think of anything we could do around this issue of deterrence?
No, because the only way the states really tend to enforce things are post post breach or post exposure with fines and maybe additional regulatory audits and the usual after the fact penalties. But uh, I don't know if deterrence isn't going to work maybe the trick is to incentivize with grant money the critical infrastructure and the operators of that critical infrastructure. So while you spend money on deterrence, I don't know if it's effective or even possible at the state agency, but incentivization to do the right thing certainly is. So maybe you flip the coin over.
I was kind of going with National Guard, but
Oh, well, okay. That, you know what? I never would have answered that until the last year, but
yeah.
maybe there's something to that. Maybe there's
Listen,
something
the,
to
the
that.
guard, the guard is really stepping up.
And they're talented cyber wise. If people
Yes,
do
they
not
are.
know that, the National Guard is very talented in cybersecurity. So
Right. So this is where the tag, right? The adjutant general, who is the boss of state military, usually the head of emergency management division and the state's liaison to Homeland Security. This is the kind of, in conversation with the federal government, right? Where are our boundaries here? Title 10, Title 50, right? Depends on whether you're working for the state or the federal government. I think there's a there. I like the idea of deterrence. It could also cause really bad blowback. Okay. All right. So here's the Washington State Initiative, and hopefully in your state, similar things are going on. Cyber Incident Response Team. So the Emergency Management Division leads this. It was created under the Emergency Worker Program, which I believe comes out of the Stafford Act, right? The Stafford Act is what guides what's allowable and what's not when there has been a disaster that has been declared, right? So we'd have to have a disaster declared. And again, we're using Wisconsin as the precedent for this, and they have something like 600 volunteer responders that meet, I think, monthly, and are sound fairly capable of being able to put critical infrastructure back together.
there's a similar initiative in Washington happening right now, Mike. I don't know if you know this.
This
They're
is it.
trying
This is
to.
what I'm talking about.
Oh, okay. Okay. Sorry. I see it's the same one.
We go to the same meetings, dude.
Yeah. Okay.
All right. So they want to be active about mid 2026. I'm on the list. If anybody wanted to investigate becoming one of those volunteer responders, there's Nick's email address right there. I will say this, there are two problems that had to be solved: indemnification and credentialing, right? So credentialing, do we know that you're actually capable of going into that damn operation and figuring out how to make programmable logic controllers work again? And then indemnification, well, if you're an Amazon employee that's part of this volunteer effort, if you walk into that dam, 15 Amazon lawyers are going to be behind you, right? So I think they work through these things using the Wisconsin model. We need to formalize this interagency cybersecurity structure. Again, these are the initiatives going on at our state to comply or to align with that executive order that puts infrastructure protection on us. So cross-sector state, federal cybersecurity regulatory review. Okay, what are those regulations? How can we co-opt those for states or for our state and get the same outcome without having to rely on the federal government? No cost audits from the state auditor's office, and there will be one thing they did talk about was their budget is such that they can't do penetration tests as part of that anymore, so it'll be assessments, right? So when they say audits, right, they call that a performance audit, and that's a little bit of a weird government level to pull so that they can do this legally. Create support for cross-sector response. Okay, so because cascading failures are a thing, if power goes down, everything goes down after that. We're gonna have to put it all back together. It's got more of a focus on state agencies than anything else. Um, but I do anticipate that this will get pushed out to the private sector when we start talking about a sector coordinating council that's within the state. We want to increase the funding for local cyber improvements. So tailored legislative funding. See, the problem is budgets are crushed. I don't know where this money is going to come from. So you got to up the taxes, or you got to go to the Utilities Commission and have them increase rates so that we can do things like secure the water and the waste sectors, things like that. We are going through the second to the last round of the state local cyber grant program. The state is going to submit all of those projects to CISA and FEMA. I'm sure they're going to say okay on that. And again, we talked about this year being $3 million. Next year is only $2 million left. So this is dwindling. The state STIC, the Threat Intelligence and Incident Response Center. So the adjutant general was briefed on this. And his direction, General Welsh, was just be prepared to do that. Right? Okay, well, we got to have money to do that. And there's no money. So we want to continue to work with existing critical infrastructure relationships. That's what we can do now. This, I think, like the other states where they're talking about operation centers, this is a virtual SOC, right? And they want it to be for low resourced organizations. And so when we say low resourced organizations, remember, most of critical infrastructure is in the hands of the private sector. And I believe that's who they're talking about. Um, yeah, not likely with our budget. And so last meeting I went to of the state cybersecurity advisory committee was this ain't going to happen. All right. So we don't have that for statewide telemetry, but we do have this. And this is not exclusive to Washington State. So Pisces, Public Infrastructure Security Cyber Education System. This is what Pisces does. No cost cyber monitoring for small local governments, public utilities, rural healthcare, school districts, pulling metadata off those networks, putting it in a monitoring stack, and then students in about 15 universities, 12 of which are in our state, are learning to be cyber analysts, which is the fifth fastest growing job in the country, by being cyber analysts, right? It's live fire. So in this way, we get some infrastructure protection. We definitely get workforce development, and there are research opportunities for graduate students. And in fact, there's going to be a whole lot of machine learning going on over the next couple of quarters. Here's the way Pisces works, just quickly. If you're interested in having this in your state, that's certainly something we could talk about. Pisces handles curriculum agreements with schools, statements of service with the local governments, et cetera, that are monitored. And Pisces provides engineering support, oversight analysts, professional analysts to work with students to give them feedback on their tickets, things like that. We make technical communications out to affected jurisdictions, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we have something we can leverage in this state. And in fact, the National Governors Association is a real fan of Pisces, and it's likely we're going to be expanding into more states. We're expanding right now into Hawaii, Montana. New York had us in the governor's budget until all non-discretionary or all discretionary funding requests were just zeroed out. So we think New York is going to come back. And interestingly, we have been asked to deploy the monitoring stack that we are using now. It's called Malcolm, right? Again, malcolm.fyi, malcolm.fyi, and you can read about this, is for monitoring operational technologies. The Department of Energy has asked us to deploy those into dam operations and to train students in OT security so that the DOE can pay them to be paid internships in dam operations. So we're getting serious about it in this state. All right, so that's what state needs to do. What do local governments need to do? So local governments need to sign up for Pisces monitoring, especially if you're in Washington State. If you're in another state, we can certainly have that conversation, but we do need to have conversations at the state government level. We can't do this in a vacuum. But we will monitor your local governments and bolt that onto your colleges and universities. And you can have hundreds of analysts that are mining for aberrational events in your network. Support internships. Yeah, when people roll off the assembly line, they still need more experience. And local government and frankly, a lot of private sector, these are low-cost resources, and they are coming off with operational experience in real-time events and critical infrastructure. They're not bad. Uh, Use available grant funding to address the three prevalent ways that your network is compromised: credential abuse, social engineering, and vulnerability exploit. And number one, and this is the biggest deal to me, rescind the policy of de minimis use. So again, I said this was going to be a little bit government centric, and this is specifically for local governments. So people that work in local government are super entitled, and they've always known that they can use government technology for personal use as long as it doesn't create a security problem, cost extra, or affect productivity. I can prove it does all three. So if you rescind this policy of de minimis use and you say all personal use will be on a personal device, Facebook lives here, Gmail lives here, I can prove through measurements that I made at the city of Seattle and through other research that's occurred that that will reduce your attack surface by 40%. And if you can drive 40% of the problem off a cliff with a policy change, why not do it? Okay, all right. So that takes us to our last 10 minutes. that we have reserved for QA. So what do we have for QA? Haley, I know you're back there somewhere. We have any questions that we can address?
I think I see one, Mike, here. It was how will federal agency cybersecurity be affected by government shutdown? Which
Oh,
is a fascinating question.
it is.
It's probably another hour if we wanted to talk on
I
that.
know
But
we didn't really get into the shutdown much, but
right, right.
you know,
Yeah. Do you have an answer? You're closer to that one than I am.
well,
So
I just read that something like three-quarters of the people that work at CISA are getting furloughed. All right. So right there, that tells you, the people that are working on things that we need them to be working on are not going to be there to be working on those things. But worse than that, right? Because CISA is also tasked with, protecting federal systems, or at least applying policy and guidance to that. Um, Most of the people that work in federal cybersecurity are contractors, and that's it. Government shutdown is you're just gone. That's it. And so, for example, let's say that Cisco comes out with a vulnerability and announces and says, here's the patch, right? So without all those contractors and the CISA folks there, excuse me, to apply that patch, we're going to be looking at some carnage, right? It happens every time, even when there are people there. So
yeah.
the next time some vulnerability comes out on a piece of technology that faces the internet, there's not going to be anybody to join the race there, drop what they're doing, treat it like an incident, and get that patch applied before the scanner and the automated exploit comes around and finds them. That's what I think is going to happen. We're going to start losing, you know, to espionage, to criminals, to whoever, a whole lot of federal systems, and it's going to look bad. That's what I think. What do you think?
Yeah, I think the timing, considering the geopolitical climate, I mean, you're just lining up making us as vulnerable as possible at a time when we're the risk of a cyber attack in particular, because it's probably a low level war as opposed to really hot, missiles flying kind of thing, although drones are flying. I just think the timing is a little bit concerning. Let's put
Yeah.
concerning as the word.
Okay, so Noah says, "Can I get the data for de minimis use?" The answer is no. That was so long ago that I don't have a copy of that anymore. There are people that can corroborate this that still work at the city of Seattle and in the Washington State Fusion Center, but I can't give you that data. I will say that that number 40% that we got from the city of Seattle systems, right? 40% of the compromises were due to the use of personal email, right? And there's been other research that came up with that exact same number, 40%.
Yeah,
So I feel pretty solid about that.
yeah.
Daniel says, Fred, you mentioned that the HIPAA changes are moving forward. What's the current state? And will it likely be 2026 before the new requirements are enforced?
Okay, so our information, we are the American Hospital Association's preferred provider for MDR and for HIPAA risk assessment. So we are very tightly coupled with the American Hospital Association. We get briefings, uh, confidential briefings from their lobbyists and from their connections within government and within the floor of Congress. What we have heard, because they give us a legislative kind of view of where things are at, while everyone thought this would die with the new administration, with the Congress, it apparently has not been killed, and it is apparently still alive. So you mentioned, what about new enforcements? New enforcement. Well, the new requirements, of course, need to be accepted, and then there will probably be a rulemaking period that follows that, which says here's how you interpret those rules, and then there will be some period in time in which enforcement will begin. But it's all contingent on whether this continues to move forward. The fact that it hasn't received, its send off into oblivion, I, I don't know. Maybe you could construe that as a positive sign in this current legislative environment, that anything that has no chance would have already been killed off. So there is hope, and I think many of us do hope that this moves forward, because it's not that big of an additional lift. It just codifies a couple things that Frank, I'm going to be honest with you. I'm tired of having conversations with people saying encryption is not mandatory because it's an addressable requirement. There's no
Mhm.
risk assessment on Earth at this point in time that can support that as not being a required element. So,
Yeah,
my 2 cents.
I agree. Is the comment period still open or is that closed?
Don't know. I can't
I
comment.
think it's
Don't know on that
closed.
one.
I
Yeah.
think it's closed.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's see. Anonymous says Nebraska has a great unit of cyber folks. Yeah, the Guard is really good. They've gotten really good at this. And in our state, it's Air National Guard. They are really good at this. What did they used to call them? The offensive cyber unit or something like that, and they had to back that off because it sounded too warlike, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Any more questions? Anybody want to ask a question? And hopefully everybody's got something out of this and you understand what the difficulties are that have just been piled onto us. And watch what your state is doing because states are going to have to compensate for this executive order. And if we lose the Information Sharing Act at midnight tonight, like we think we're going to, and the state local cyber grant program doesn't come back, and CISA has reduced capability to do the things that they've always done, it is going to be up to us. It is going to be up to us to be volunteer responders, to engage in information sharing, to do all of the things that are going to address the geopolitical situation in the world that seems to be spilling over into our critical infrastructure. And remember, critical infrastructure, yeah, well, it's chemical manufacturing plants, but it's also your local government, your flushing toilet, your drinking water, 911, things like that, things that affect you at the scale you live, right? A hospital call center is hugely important, right? So, with that, we're going to let you go. We'll give everybody 3.5 minutes back. Fred, good seeing you. Good chatting with you.
All right. We'll see you soon.
Yep. Bye, everybody.